realistic, so I'm a little worried for myself.
Are you feeling it?
No, I'm not
Okay.
really. So, good morning, Ryan Patch from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Welcome back.
Glad to be here. For record, Ryan Patch from my Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Last week was here with Jane Lazorchak and Billy Coster from the Agency of Natural Resources to provide an overview of the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Vermont Climate Council, and I'm here to provide a bit of framing around recommendations related to agriculture, both on the mitigation front as well as building resilience for our farms and the services that can provide to other neighbors in Vermont. I shared a presentation which would be available likely under my name from last Friday, and I'm going to continue to refer to that, but I will also share my screen so folks can follow along. I find this topic is quite complicated and has a lot of areas of interest that one can dive down. We have, the science behind climate change and what that means for the impacts in Vermont, what it means for Vermont agriculture. We have a framing of agriculture in Vermont and
it's under last Wednesday.
Last Wednesday. Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry, not last Friday. And what's the current state of agriculture? How is it, affecting, emissions rates? How does it affect sequestration? And then conversations about the recommended action plan from the Global Warming Solutions Act and how is the state looking to implement that? So last week I shared, I think, a bit of the framing of what is changing in the climate for Vermont, and generally the summary that we have is it's getting warmer and wetter. However, it is not being distributed on a nice, even, gentle soaking rain. The chance of episodic drought is likely going to increase, and even though we are seeing a total increase in precipitation, the distribution is not potentially going to be equal. The Vermont Climate Assessment that UVM put together pointed out how there is a chance that there will be less precipitation than average in the main growing season months, so June, July, and August. And that's what this chart here at the bottom demonstrates, with more rain coming when we're not actively farming and generally may have more rain. Looking over the past 4 or 5 decades, definitely an increase in precipitation. And so I attempted to introduce a theme that's run through a number of different initiatives for agriculture as it relates to the environment and how agriculture can either address water quality impacts and improve water quality, or in this case, soil health, and the focus on the soil tells the story of both the opportunity to provide climate mitigation benefit through increased rates of sequestration, but also to provide resilience to the farm fields and the crops that are being grown, but also the potential for those fields to absorb and hold more of the extreme types of weather and precipitation events that are happening and are predicted to continue to happen and increase. And so this slide was just information from NRCS, which shows that for every % increase in soil organic matter, you can hold up to 20 to 25,000 gallons of water per acre. Inch of rain is about 27,000 gallons. So, the more you increase your organic matter, the more you can hold that rain in times of drought, and the more it can percolate, infiltrate, and then gently get introduced into the stream system, hopefully abating that really flashy surface runoff that happens on impervious surface, which generally we think of roads or what have you. But if you have a heavily degraded ag soil that's been tilled and pounded, that can cap right over, and rainfall can hit that and run right off. And so focusing on the soil and soil health is a real nexus for co-benefits, as I said, water, climate, resilience, as well as other outcomes. I wanted something I'd added since the last time that I'm hopeful will work with technology is a 1-minute video from the University of North Dakota, which I think does a really good job of outlining some of the, through a rain simulator, we have a few of these in Vermont. I don't know if members of the committee have been to a field day where they've maybe seen a demonstration like this, but just to exemplify the power of focusing on soil health and the principles of soil health, I'm hoping that this will play. However, I may have muted my, okay, we're not muted. Turn up some volume. Hopefully it works.
It talks about water movement into soil. So in these 4 pans, we have the same soil type, just in different managements. In the pans, we have moldboard plow, CRP, recently converted CRP to cropland, and 15 years of no-till. So what we'll see is how water moves across the surface in these front bins and how water moves through the soil and the bins behind it.
I'm sorry, could we have a further definition of these forms?
Yeah, absolutely.
That was really quick.
It was. So if you can see my cursor, this is out of North Dakota, conventional moldboard plowing. So full width tillage was very common in Vermont up until, the real focus on soil health, but basically dropping and inverting the soil profile on an annual basis and then having secondary tillage to really smooth everything out so you can have a planting surface to get your seeder in and have the crops grow. CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program. It's the largest conservation program in the country, and it is a rental for 15 to 30 years to take land out of production and put it into a grass buffer. We have about 2,000 acres of CREP, which has a state enhancement, and it's basically a buffer program. In other regions of the country, it can be used as a whole field kind of retirement program, but that tends to not be how it's used in Vermont.
Right. Excuse me. So buffer program meaning around the perimeter of
riparian buffer in Vermont.
Okay.
So rivers, minimum of 35, 50 feet. And in Vermont, they're generally not grassed because that's a requirement. It's a forested riparian buffer. So taking land out of production and planting native tree species to have a buffer. It's called the CREP program. There's about 2,000 acres statewide in Vermont.
CREP.
CREP in Vermont.
Yes.
And it's the E because the state program agency of ag provides an enhancement. So we pay for practice and signing incentive payment and assigning incentive payment. So we kind of bolster it because there are some cropland in Vermont is pretty valuable. We don't have too much of it relative to other areas. And so this is an example. This third chamber is CREP. When let's say the 15 or 30 year contract expires, you can return it to farming. It's just a rental program. And so this is showing what happens when you take sod and till it. And then on the right is, I think they'll say 6 to something year no-till, which has heavy residue and is able to be planted annually using a no-till drill as an example. And they'll talk about the focus I have on this is where's the runoff going? Is it running off the sample? Is it running through the sample? And how clean is that runoff? Those are the things that I like to look for. You'll see there are, and they'll zoom in on it a lot more, containers below both the front and the underside of those containers. And this is a really great way on a field day to go around a farm and take a bunch of samples from different areas, those that are in hay, those that are in pasture, and really look at what the difference in management can affect on how soil behaves when it's saturated with a pretty serious rainstorm. All right.
As you can see, this is simulating a pounding rain on some of these different soil management systems. So you can see on the moldboard plow pan, that soil is running off the surface and it's actually quite muddy in that first jug. Underneath, there's very little water that's moving through that soil deeper into the soil profile. On the CRP, you can see that the water running off of the surface is quite clear, and a lot of that water is infiltrating through that soil, which would recharge deeper in the soil profile. In the recently converted CRP, some of that disturbance is leading to a little bit of runoff, but then also water moving through that soil and still infiltrating. On the last pan, we have wheat on a 15-year no-till soil. And you can see that the water that is running off is very clear, but most of the water is actually moving through that soil and infiltrating deeper into the soil profile. After 1 inch of water in this demonstration, you can see how the water either moves across the surface or down through the soil profile. You can catch this demonstration on the NDSU Soil Health Bus Tour, taking place on the NDSU.
Well, the bus tour was in 2018 in North Dakota, so we probably won't be able to catch that one. Yeah, we missed the bus. But this is, 1 inch rainstorm, pounding rainstorm. You can see moldboard plow, the soil aggregates have been destroyed, soil's been chopped up, it's not held in place by permanent sod or the glues that can occur in a no-till system. There's no residue on the surface, and so that those pounding raindrops will, lift the soil and it'll run off the field. And so this is really what the focus has been on the water quality front, which you'll hear about this afternoon. But the soil as a focus for the opportunity for farms to address water quality also has the co-benefits for climate that the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee really focused on, and where I'll transition to making the presentation regarding how we sought to address the power of the soil.
Any questions just on that before Ryan progresses? Yes, Ryan.
So have you done any of that type of testing day after you put manure in the field?
I haven't seen a rain simulator. Have I? No, I haven't seen one, but that would be interesting. It'd be fun to compare, a hay field that's been surface applied liquid manure versus composted manure versus injected manure, whether it's in a hay field or a cornfield. And, obviously we have edge of field studies that study the runoff from those conditions, whether it's surface applied, injected, what have you. So those studies exist. But as far as a visual demonstration, as you point out, the surface application right before a heavy rain definitely isn't the best for water.
I would add to that categorization your naturally deposited manures as well.
A lot of integrity in a manure pad, absolutely. Nice spherical, contained.
Or pellets if you're a sheep.
If you're a sheep, yeah, absolutely. So the power, I covered this last time. This is from the State of Soil Health study that University of Vermont conducted in 2021, 2022, published in 2022. A lot of charts on here. Summary, supporting soil health adoption can result in a rising soil organic matter on a year-on-year basis. A realistic accumulation of soil could sequester an equivalent of 937,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents annually. That is the same as removing 200,000 cars from the road. For the hay and corn fields in Vermont.
Yeah, but you gave it a metric for how much, but how much land?
All of 500,000 acres of the state. So supporting soil health and the positive trajectory of soil organic matter, over 19 years could raise that from 4.3%, which is the statewide average, to 6%. And some other really interesting, just about what is the state of soil health that they found that even compared to New York, our Vermont fields are higher on average of soil organic matter, and we're way above the national average. It's around 3%. This was around 4.3%. And that, New York's a heavy dairy state. And so it's not just the animal manures, but it's a lot of the management that's happening on farms already.
Ryan?
Yes.
I don't want to cut you off, but
Please, no.
we leave the slide anyway.
Yep.
I guess for some context, what those 200,000 cars, when we're thinking in terms of reaching a level by 2025, 2030, how much closer does that get us to the levels that we're being asked to hit?
So by comparison, there are about 190,000 passenger cars that are registered in Vermont on an annual basis. And transportation is our largest sector. But as we'll get to in the presentation, and one of the main recommendations of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and work that is ongoing is how this sequestration potential is not currently captured in the state of Vermont's emission inventory. And so that's kind of a discussion of there's a lot of power in the soil. It's really important for agriculture, and it's not currently captured in the emissions inventory. So,
and when we say investments in soil building, talking about what we just looked at with the 4 different. Okay, good. And
cover crop. Note to all the water quality practices have a co-benefit for improving soil health.
Thank you, Jeff.
Brian, the 500,000 acres of ag land, Vermont, could it still be actively worked supporting the ag industry and still achieve that carbon sequestration equivalent over 200,000 cars a year?
Yes, the study,
Using absolute best practices of maintaining or increasing volume of organic matter, surface organic matter.
yes, that is the thought output of the study, which is maintaining that land and agricultural production and continuing to implement soil health practices would result in that increase in soil carbon accumulation.
Could you tell me or us what the name of that study was? Is it a document, a publication?
Yep, this link is right here at the bottom. I'd be happy to submit that. You can talk to the researchers, Heather Darby at UVM Extension, Northwest Crop and Soils was the lead on that. And it's from University of Vermont Extension, and they did a statewide sampling to understand what the current state of soil health is, because that's a really important part, I think, about setting targets and setting goals. There is a net zero target, net zero goal in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so that's where sequestration can be counted and applied. But yes, the whole point of this slide is you can keep farming, we can keep growing the food and crops, and you can have this positive accumulation in soil carbon through improvements in management. And farmers are already heavily engaged in adopting those practices, which is the future slides that I try to establish before digging into, well, how do we count and track those changes in management? What does it mean for mitigation?
Representative Templeman and then Representative Bright.
I mean, you can continue if.
Well, we haven't reached noon yet and the sun isn't going down. You all may have more questions, but Ryan, I'm going to look forward to reaching out to you because I'm looking for comparative real data and science on sequestration. And it's either ag land, it isn't going to come from parking lots, come from ag land or forest land. So I don't want to burden this committee with all that inquiry.
So one of my concerns, Ryan, is that these practices are wonderful. I practice them myself, but correct me if I'm wrong. If one then applies synthetic nitrogen to the soil, that actually counteracts a lot of these actions. I understand that ammonic nitrogen combines with or releases carbon from the soil, breaking down the organic material, maybe just as fast as it's being built, maybe faster. So if we are giving payment for ecosystem services and we're calculating this, yet the farmers are still applying nitrogen fertilizer, there's a discrepancy there, wouldn't there be?
It depends.
That's a very scientific answer.
It depends on your practices.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at net or gross, or and
Net?
meaning the net balance and change in carbon? There is, depending on the scenario, a bit of urea, to kick off the crop compared to the amount of organic matter that's applied through manure. The manure very likely can offset either the release of the nitrous oxide from the application of the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to the impact that synthetic fertilizer has on soil biology, decreasing its ability to uptake organic nitrogen as an example. So it depends the degree to which it's used. And the other supporting practices that are applied. But just because you apply synthetic nitrogen, in my mind, it wouldn't negate all of the other practices that are happening on the soil. But
Right, but it's a calculation. I just wanted to get the acknowledgement that the application of synthetic nitrogen undoes some of this work.
yes.
Yeah, and then one other thing too, there's a conflicting argument regarding capacity of carbon and organic material in soils. One argument would say that you reach a maximum and that's it. So these practices are only effective to a point. The other argument is that once you achieve maximum capacity, then after that, you're building more soil on top of that, and it's a forever bank and a deepening of the soil base. What's your?
My understanding, and in the slide here, they say a 19-year horizon. My understanding is soil carbon sequestration as a focus is a medium-term solution, meaning soils eventually will become saturated with, depending on the constituent parts of sand, silt, and clay. Each soil has a different capacity to store different amounts of carbon. However, so eventually, yes, you can saturate a soil. Vermont, as this study shows, Vermont is not yet saturated. And this is an approach that by changing practices in 1 year, by planting a cover crop or adjusting your nutrient management or going to no-till, you can have an immediate effect of additional carbon being taken out of the atmosphere and put into the soil. And so there's no lead time. As in afforestation, it can take a while for that growth to really achieve that full storage. And the benefit of other technology interventions, it can take a while to stand up a whole electrification fleet for the state as an example. And so this is an immediate opportunity that can have permanent sequestration, but for which it is a medium-term option because yes, soils can eventually become saturated.
So you don't believe that it's possible to continually build up that soil level, like in elevation? I mean, imagine the deposits of animals and.
I mean, you look at the prairies before we, grew a whole bunch of corn or crops without returning that organic matter. And you look at the change in horizon. I think the building soil up is, I think soil builds down generally. That being said, depending on your management practices, the horizon of, topsoil out west has obviously been depleted and lost through erosion and other practices. So building it back up requires, a lot of time. So I think you're gonna have to pose that to a soil scientist or an agronomist to get the answer that fully explores that. All I can say is my understanding is there's a saturation point. But if you still have manures and you're applying organic matter, I imagine you can keep building that up.
Or down.
Or down.
Can you make a note to have us invite a soil scientist? I think it would be worth continuing this conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Representative Rice.
Yeah, somewhat relatedly, I think for the sort of overall picture of climate health moving forward, we also know that shifting to no-till, planting cover crops, and then flooding your fields with glyphosate, for instance, is also not the answer. Sort of building soil health and decimating biodiversity it gets us toward a different climate problem. So I'm just wondering how that balance comes into play in your office, in the recommendations in the ag recommendations of the climate plan. Sort of how do you weigh the importance of biodiversity versus the importance of soil health?
I think biodiversity is, there is a biodiversity crisis, right? And just fixing soil organic sequestration doesn't address the loss of habitat and other things that occur in the world. I will say I think Vermont is in much better shape than a lot of places. As I'll get to a slide eventually, for every acre of land that's in active farming, whether it's crop or pasture, farms manage an acre of forest land. Right? And so when you think of a farm, it's more than just the fields being tilled. There are required buffers. There are areas that can't be farmed. There are areas that are in forest. And so thinking about a farm complex is where my mind goes to first. When you talk about the steps of growing food or crops and what does it mean to use chemical termination of crops, I think we're on a trajectory. You listen to Gabe Brown or others that are out there in kind of the soil health space in agriculture, and they talk about the transition, the time it took them to go from, well, before it was just a single application of glyphosate, it was a mixture of 12 different, much more noxious or less more impactful pesticides, right? And that through no-till and other practices, you can step it down to one application. And Mr. Brown has gone to a very modest application once every 8 years, right? So this kind of, the discussion is around, I think, in part, economics, in part risk management, and in part a transition and discussion about how focusing on soil health practices can, in time, support less utilization of those pesticides. And so where no-till has you spray, you have a brownfield. When it was full width tillage, it was a mixture of many more different types that you just didn't see. And then the crop would grow and look nice. So it's definitely part of the discussion. It is a recommendation for further study, as well as policy discussion. And that's where the Ag Innovation Board filled that recommendation as a space which has multiple stakeholders to discuss those topics and make recommendations for decreasing use and improving outcomes. So it's definitely part of the discussion. It's not it's something where there's a lot of different voices and opinions. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's there's no silver bullet. I don't think.
Ryan, we've only got you for another 10 minutes.
Oh goodness!
So I'm just. I know you've offered to come back another time to finish if we need to. But if there's a point that you'd like to get to today that you think would be sort of like a good sort of point, we'll let you just plow through.
All right, I will use 7 minutes to try to talk about the inventory. Just to orient you, section 11.4 of the Climate Action Plan and section 14 are both about sequestration. And the recommended focus of practices are outlined A through J here, and then the corresponding program at Agency of Agriculture that supports that program implementation is then highlighted on the right-hand side. So it's an acronym soup. You can learn more about it, but basically there is coverage for implementation through existing agricultural programs. And that's one of the recommendations is continue to utilize the existing service delivery model, which is the Clean Water Investment and Improvement Framework that is at the Agency of Agriculture that supports the adoption and implementation of these practices on farms. Farmers, as I said, they're doing a lot. Over 300,000 acres, 350,000 acres have been implemented since 2016. This has resulted in the phosphorus reduction statistic. Over 95% of the phosphorus reductions have come from agriculture, mostly from those agronomic practices in fields. It is the most cost effective. And this is where the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee really looked for the opportunity, which is investments in the soil. Okay, so now just what I'll leave you with is this is an area of ongoing research. The state ANR received a grant from the U.S. Climate Alliance, and they're working on contracting with an identified qualified contractor to explore this friction point or gap that came up in the review for agriculture from the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that is emission reduction requirements, net zero targets, and the state's current emission inventory. When the state's emission inventory was stood up in 2006, the guidance at the time is what we have today, which is an analysis of agriculture. And in that is enteric fermentation, the storage of manure, and nitrous oxide emissions from soil, which is from fertilizer applications. This is the kind of summary of those. And then, of course, also from soils includes liming and urea fertilization. What's not included in the 16% is the land use change in forestry. So all of the sequestration potential is not part of that. International guidance has changed in both the AR5 in 2016 and the recent publication sustains it, which takes that formerly separate agriculture emission, LULUCF, and combines them together into another bad acronym, AFOLU, ag, forestry, and other land use. That other land use is wetlands, urban green space, all those things that aren't developed space. So AFOLU is that comprehensive sector, and that's how national inventories from the IPCC are directed to be accounted. The state emission inventory hasn't been updated since '06. And so there's a research project out there to evaluate the current model, which is the SIT tool, which does have a land use change and forestry module. It does have an ag emissions module. Can they be synthesized, and what's missing from them? So this is a change over time. These are example mitigation strategies. And so the reason for this is not growing crops is not created equal. We know this for water quality. On the left is an example of a rather steep hill in full width tillage after a good rainstorm, lots of concentrated flow areas, a lot of erosion. You can see deposition at the bottom of the hill. And on the right, it's a flatter field admittedly, but you can see cover crop as an example of and other managements that can be stacked on top of it that provide both a water quality benefit as well as an emission reduction coefficient. And so the parallel is farmers are doing all this work to clean up the water. That's resulting in these phosphorus reductions, and working on setting up a similar accounting system for sequestration. The challenge, I think, is so this is an example of how different practices can have gross or net benefits on, or sometimes can make positive emissions. Not every practice has a net sequestration potential, especially when you include soil nitrous oxide releases. Point being, in the SIT tool, the theory is cropland and grassland is biogenically neutral, right? Whatever you harvest is what is sequestered. What we know is you can degrade the total amount of soil organic matter, you can increase the total amount of soil organic matter. And so it's not granular enough. It's not process-based. It doesn't allow the different management techniques that farmers utilize to be accounted to show that directional decrease or increase in soil organic matter on an annual basis. The other, farmers manage 47% of the land they manage is woodland, and maple syrup is one of those areas of jurisdiction between forest parks and recreation agency of ag. The collection of maple sap is farming. And so that's another outstanding question. That is farming, it's agriculture, it's not accounted for in the emissions inventory in any way. Maybe it's captured in the forest land, total carbon storage in the LULUCF, but it is a specific land use that is in some parts agriculture and isn't currently counted. So ag forestry of the land use sector, this is from the IPCC. Takeaway is that it's different than every other sector. It's unique because the mitigation potential is derived from both an enhancement of removals of greenhouse gases as well as reduction of emissions through management of land and livestock. And so the place where we have emissions on a farm, on the same unit of land, you can have a cow with the manure and the enteric fermentation, which is the largest source and what's counted in the emission inventory, but the forage on which it's feeding and when the manure is applied, the total carbon accumulation that can happen from that, you can have emissions and sequestration from the same unit of land, and the current emissions inventory isn't granular enough to really account for all of those managements that happen in this unit of land. So when we have the Global Warming Solutions Act emission reduction requirements, that's just looking at the emissions from a cow, and a cow is very static as far as a natural system. There are, we can install a digester, and there are 18 of them in the state to cap and flare or ideally utilize the methane from the storage of that manure. And so that's an example of emission reduction practice that a farm can adopt and turn that methane into CO2 and count that as a credit, as well as generate energy. And so that's an example of how agriculture can address the emissions reduction side of the ledger However, the term used in the Global Warming Solutions Act is mitigation, which includes the need to both decrease emissions as well as increase sequestration. And agriculture does both. And so the outstanding research that needs to happen is what is the right model or method for tracking and accounting for those particular impacts from agriculture. Just to make a note, when the Biden administration rejoined the Paris Accord, the framework for that, the NDC, is the United States is setting an economy-wide target of reducing its net greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in 2030. And so just looking to agricultural lands, there's that framing. You can both reduce emissions and sequester more carbon dioxide. Within the Global Warming Solutions Act, the regulatory hook is just the emission side. And, looking at agriculture, that soil carbon exchange is not part of that emission part of the ledger. And so how do we connect agriculture to its soil is one of the outstanding recommendations that was made by the Climate Action Plan to look at how to develop a methodology and move towards a synthesis which looks more at the ag, forestry, and the land use sector than just ag emissions and then the land use change and forestry. I'm close to meeting my target, but there's a lot of different models that exist out there that are more process based and can take account for cover crop and no-till and rotations and nutrient management, rather than just these are the number of cows, those are the emissions from number of cows. These are the number of acres, these are the emissions from acres. That's what the current SIT tool uses. And so we're trying to get to more granular and accurate accounting for the ways in which Vermont farmers are managing above average to really account for that increase in sequestration. Sorry, I'm hopping around. The question about what is a recommendation for, so we talked about, I'll spend a lot of time on soils, right? That's where, because there's significant potential there. We talked about mitigation strategies, emission reduction strategies from the storage of manure. We have water quality standards in the state, and so you can't have runoff, and so, and a winter spreading ban. And so if you can't spread in the winter, you got to store your manure. And if you store your manure, you're going to have emissions of methane. And so the ability to cover those manure storages, either cap and flare it or ideally use it, is a strategy, because you take that methane, you convert it to CO2, and you can make electricity, you can make heat, you can make renewable natural gas off of those systems. And so a lot of opportunity to use that stored battery power rather than just to let it off gas, turning it into a useful energy source. Challenge being it's very expensive. And we have a lot of small farms, and so the technologies aren't exactly there. When it comes to cows, which was another major part of the inventory, it's a biological system. There's research, and the recommendation is to continue research into the right strategies. EPA recommends getting the most milk per cow, right? Because that reduces the emissions per unit of milk or unit of cow, and dairy from bovine from cows, or according to the FAO, some of the most energy, the least CO2 emissions per calorie of protein that comes out of the milk. So, dairy cows do a pretty good job compared to some other less efficient types of ruminant animals. And, research into feed additives that may reduce enteric fermentation are in their infant stages, and something that more research needs to be done to make sure it has the claim reductions and that it's safe for cow and ruminant health. So that's an area of feed management, which has been an ongoing discussion in both the water space and now interfaces with climates for how can you develop a feeding ration that maintains milk production while either reducing gross phosphorus inputs or either decreasing the potential for enteric fermentation as an example through what's being fed. Yeah, so sorry to jump around in the presentation, trying to get through the important parts, but there's a lot here to continue to dig into the details if the committee is interested. But
Yes.
point being, Vermont farmers are already doing a lot in the water space that has a lot of soil health benefits, and we're tracking the phosphorus benefits. All those practices can be counted for a mitigation benefit towards net zero goals, and that's what we're working with ANR on. And that RFP is really important to dig further into the emissions inventory and the current bridge that's created between the soil and the cow.
Well, I'm impressed that you managed to get as much into the last 10 or 15 minutes there as you did. I think so we already noted that we might want to, I agree that, yeah, we want to dig in more, and we've already noted, maybe hearing from a soil scientist.
I just sent you some links.
Great. Before we all leave Montpelier this afternoon, maybe we can just have a quick, or not so quick, conversation about how else we would like to dig into this. And I know there's a lot here just in the presentation that maybe you feel like you would want to just come back and focus on a couple of slides. But we'll see what the committee's thoughts are. I do want to take a break before our next witness. So is it a quick question?
Quick. Ryan, do you have a publication? Some of those reports are from 2014, some ones were 2007. And do you have a current binder of some of these details that we could have in our committee room to absorb at less than 700 words per minute or 7,000 words? If so, could you either point us to it, where we acquire one, et cetera? Thank you.
I can work on trying to put together the resources that I turn to. The reading section 11.4 of the Climate Action Plan or section 14, there are references there to the claims that can provide some of those primary sources for it. But that provides a good overview. And yes, I will do some looking and some discussion with others and try to come up with a synthesis.
Hard copy of those pages.
Okay. Yeah, can certainly print that out as well.
Thank you. Is it quick question, John? Because I want to take a break and move on to our next.
It's sort of a transitional question.
Perfect.
Between Danielle and Ryan. Is there any data, you're a data guy, on essentially former working lands in Vermont? So all these farms are going out of business, or we're right at that point, like in Tunbridge, there are 4 dairy farms left. If they go out, all these open lands are going to probably start growing back in or redeveloped, one or the other. Mm-hmm. So in that sort of, call them non-working, former working lands, if those are not developed but essentially become sort of generational forest, what's sort of the carbon sequestration there? Is it about the same as it would be with really well-managed farmland?
No, you grow carbon above ground trees, they'll store more than ag soils. So the answer is forest has more potential to store carbon than agricultural soils. American Farmland Trust has a report called Farms Under Threat, which looks at, as I opened last time, Vermont's lost 228,000 acres of cropland since 1987. What's happened to that? A lot of that's reverted to natural state. A lot of it's been developed. A lot of it's gone to other uses that aren't houses or roads, but are perhaps impervious surface of some type or another. So the question and what the working group wrestled with is the fact that if we're not growing food here, there's a term in the climate discourse of leakage, right? You will be producing food elsewhere. And so if there's emissions here, but we're just going to turn to forest, well, that's going to be emissions elsewhere. Maybe it's not in the borders of the state of Vermont, but it's happening somewhere. And so the discussion points in the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee around this is how, especially as I tried to set up last time, other regions of the country are going to have much more of a challenge growing food in the extreme heat and wildfire conditions they're going to be having. And so, long story short, discussions around, maintaining a balance of what's in agriculture, what's in forest, what's in wetlands, was a topic of discussion that the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee couldn't arrive at consensus for a recommendation, but it was a big area of discussion. The point I'm trying to make is, if the land's not in farming or growing food, we got to get that food from somewhere else. And so while we may have forests, which would add more carbon potential over 100 years, then because you got trees, they're big and tall, big chunks of carbon, you're going to have to get your food from somewhere else. And so kind of this balancing of, if we want to eat and we want to do that locally and have a robust food distribution and have some resiliency in our food system, that you will be storing less carbon on ag soils compared to forest land is just something to consider. And then also I bring up the point, for every acre of ag land we have, a farmer manages an acre of forest land. And so if we keep it an open ag land, you're stewarding that forest as well. So you get a lot of benefits from the ag land. So don't know if I answered your question. I might have gone too much into the, it's definitely a bridge to, forests are important. We have 73% of the state of Vermont is mapped to be forest. Only 12% is in ag land. So we've had a significant change in, it used to be 70% open and 30% forested. And now it's, we probably shouldn't have been farming up that high on some of the Green Mountains. Admittedly, however, just the distribution of ag land we have is much, much less than it was even 1987.
Kind of a fundamental question. So
Yeah.
well, thank you again, and we'll I'm sure see you soon next week, sometime very soon. So
Great.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
I think we'll take a short break here. Alora, if you're still with us, if you want to end this